Private markets have always been in PDFs and spreadsheets, friction everywhere. Today, our digital rails are finally coming to the last analog corner of finance, the $10 trillion market. Gareth, you co-founded Delio in your 20s with the thesis that private markets would undergo a massive digital transformation. A decade later, you're managing billions in assets across your platform, powering hundreds of funds and deals simultaneously, operating in 18 countries. Let's unpack everything. Gareth, thanks for coming to our Zinnia Media pod. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Let's start with the basics. Private markets have tripled to more than 10 trillions over the past decades while still running on PDF and manual processes. Why did this massive asset class resist digitalization for so long, and why finally this made institutions realize that they need to modernize or die, basically?
I think a couple of things. Certainly, I think scale on both sides of the ecosystem. I think product shelf around access to private markets has continued to grow. So if you look at that as one side of the equation, and I also think kind of the other side of the equation has certainly been the number of investors on the other side growing into that kind of more individual segmentation, where the typical number of investors within private markets has, of course, grown substantially.
Do you think that the fast trend on the growth on private wealth has had a big impact on that?
For sure. I think there's that kind of differing requirements and needs of a wealth investor versus kind of more a traditional institution. And I think obviously then not just that in terms of the points we alluded to earlier, but also kind of that importance of differentiation and having a more digital experience, more in line with how people operate in other aspects of their life. It's kind of become more of an expectation than a nice to have. So I certainly think it is, but I think that is fundamentally being driven by the individual, whether that's by an individual within an institution or an individual acting as themselves. I think it's kind of driving the same behavior, but totally agree that the needs and requirements can be somewhat different.
Let's double deep a bit more on your platform. So over the last couple of years, you were competing for mandates, and you're still competing on mandates against internal technology teams of massive players, massive institutions with IT budgets, right? Why they choose to white label the platform instead of doing that in-house?
I think fundamentally, whilst that they're alternative options, I still see them as quite well entwined. How we've approached building out the technology is to really enhance the infrastructure of the organization in a way that works for them. That's always been a founding principle of Delio. So I really see it as that ability for us to kind of modularize and mold it around a use case is really beneficial, and it's a large task to kind of do single-handedly, irrespective of the size of institution. In fact, as the institution gets bigger, the complexity gets larger, because they're probably working across multiple different service lines, potentially multiple different product sources, multiple different distribution channels, and that's probably built out an ecosystem over the years of a lot of manual process, a lot of fragmented ways of working, point solutions that can kind of be enhanced by what we do in collaboration with those internal teams, let's say.
Super. Gareth, there are a lot of pain points within private markets. To your understanding, you also been operating for in the space for a while, and private market is not the same today in 2026 compared to 2010, right? With the AI impact. What still needs to be solved in private markets?
I still think there's just such a massive amount of a way to go with digitization. I think there's a lot of, perhaps the conversation around digitization is still a little bit ahead of where most are operating at from a digitization perspective. And I think that's been driven by a number of factors. I think that first wave of, I guess, technology digitization, specifically around private markets, was typically built out by solutions that were using technology to achieve a goal of distributing their product, as opposed to really solving the technology needs in isolation. And I think that was combined with a bit of an undercurrent of point solutions emerging. So when you factor that in, what's kind of happened in practice is there's still a long way to go, just because those point solutions aren't necessarily solving the entire life cycle, and the product driven solutions haven't necessarily completely solved all the problems that some of these institutions are facing. So it's a monumental task. And I still think there's a long way to go, just because there's so much to do, just in terms of across the life cycle. It's a lot of process, it's a lot of considerations, it's a lot of workflow before you overlay the ecosystem themes of what's going on in private markets.
What's the biggest request that you have in general from the asset managers, the GPs you work with? What's the biggest pain point that you found out over the last couple of years?
I think the biggest, I would say, in isolation is definitely, I'd say it's kind of around, as they've grown, that service provider ecosystem has grown, and perhaps now we're seeing quite a trend of those GP and asset managers wanting to own their book of record on a more internalized basis. So have that ability to control their operating system and be, which can still work across all the different service providers that they work with. So I definitely think there's a trend towards the terminology of operating system being more common and more understood. I used to say it 5-6 years ago and probably didn't resonate as well as it does in 2025 into 2026. So I would say that's probably the core theme we're seeing in terms of GPs looking to own more of their operating infrastructure.
Let's connect Gareth, the dots with AI in private markets. AI is making everything faster, is making everything cheaper as well, is shrinking teams as well. How is AI affecting infrastructure firms like yourself?
It's affecting the whole world quite drastically and substantially. I mean, in real terms, for what we've seen in the day-to-day, that ability for our team on the engineering side have been with us for, on average, a very, very long time, since the inception of the business. So they're very well versed in what our product needs to do and what it needs to achieve. So having that expertise and capability on the technology side, but then being able to accelerate them in the way that AI can, has just been kind of transformational for the velocity of output. And I think the key thing for us we see ourselves very much as that partner for our clients, in the way that we don't just see it as an implementation and then run off into the hills. We very much see it as continuing to build and co-create and develop with a client. So that ability to take feedback much more quickly, turn that into something that can be visualized much more quickly, and then implement that into the system much more quickly enables us to really close that gap between the relationship with the customer and our ability as an engineering capacity, product capacity, to actually turn that into actual outcomes and output. I think that's been the biggest thing for us in terms of the product side.
Super. You've onboarded 50 financial institutions. What's the single most common mistake from these firms make when approaching private markets digitalization?
I think we're being reluctant to look at things end to end in terms of how they're running their private markets proposition more broadly. So I think a real kind of strategic digital private market strategy is the thing that needs to be in place before you even go on that journey, or you'll find yourself probably with a bit of a scenario in a couple of years' time, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, where you just have lots of different things becoming sticking plasters over problems rather than actually being a long-term solution for what's going on in the industry.
So, I mean, if I interpret that correctly, it would be more a top-down approach rather than a bottom-up approach. So starting from the diagnosis, strategy, the plan part, the planning, and then the execution, rather than thinking about fragmented layers across the whole value chain that standalone cannot be interconnected between them. Great. One last question here, Gareth. What's the most fascinating thing you're seeing right now in private markets?
I think it's really fascinating seeing a lot of larger infrastructure firms that have been infrastructure providers, whether on the technology side or the market side, in other asset classes, and how they move into the space. I think that's super interesting. There's a lot of people wanting to now be part of private markets or embed private markets into their offering. And I think really we're having lots of interesting conversations with lots of different types of firms trying to figure that out. And I think those that really crack it, that already have a well-established client base and service capability, and if they can bring what they've done in other areas into private markets, I just think it brings into a whole new wave of interesting competition for firms, but also interesting partnership opportunities where it can work both ways. So I think that's probably the most fascinating component for me is seeing what sort of themes are driving those sorts of decisions for larger infrastructure firms to move into private markets.
Super, Gareth. Thanks a lot for the participation. We touch different topics here: tech, infrastructure, what's happening in private markets. Been a pleasure as always. Congratulations on the transaction. And now that it's public, we can mention that as well. And looking forward to see how Delio evolves and what's up with new releases.
Thanks, Leo. Good to see you.